ways. Europe and the United States advancing freedom in a shared way. That is, our European partners and us are joined in the cause of advancing freedom, which again is very much a central and dominant theme of this administration, and so we're especially pleased that our guest this evening will be addressing that. Ambassador Fried joined the Department of State in 1977. His early and mid-career, including being posted to then Leningrad, also to Belgrade, to Warsaw. He served at the early part of his career in the Bureau of Economic Affairs at the State Department. He also was in the Office of Soviet Affairs, and he was desk officer for Poland, including a period of time when that marvelous change took place within that part of the world. He has had 2 long tenures at the National Security Council. During the first, he ended up as senior advisor to the president and senior director or special advisor and senior director for Central and Eastern Europe. And following that, he was our ambassador to Warsaw. He came back and he was an advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states. He returned again to the National Security Council and again was advisor to the president and senior director for European and Eurasian affairs, and then came from that job with the present secretary and others to his current position as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian affairs at the Department of State. It's a marvelous career. The topic is wonderful. It's a great pleasure to present Ambassador Daniel Fried.
Well, good evening, and goodness, it is a wonderful view. It is a pleasure to be here tonight with you, and a pleasure actually to get out of Washington this evening. It's maybe any evening. It's especially good to be with you here at the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. Thank you for turning out. There are too many of us to cram into one of H.L. Mencken's Mount Vernon hideouts. Might be worth it to get his take on Washington. Or we could meet at Fells Point for a good local ale. Of course, come to think of it, maybe Edgar Allan Poe could better describe Washington. It is an honor to be in your company. It's an honor to be here knowing that John Lewis Gaddis will be here later. He's a good man and a friend. It's good to have an opportunity to discuss with you America's strategy in the world and our alliance with Europe in pursuing it. And to do so, we must look beyond the media cycle and beyond the political cycle. The hardest part of strategic foreign policy thinking is to understand the difference between the headlines and what counts, between the urgent task of the day and what it is you're really trying to do. As my boss, Condoleezza Rice, has said, strategy consists of understanding where history is going and then getting behind it and trying to give it a push. In my view, and the theme of my remarks this evening, is that history is moving in the direction of freedom, and that the role of the United States is to get behind freedom and, yes, give it a push. American support for freedom is the foundation of the Bush administration's foreign policy. From fledgling democracies along Europe's frontiers of freedom, to the reformers in China, from the liberated peoples of Afghanistan and Iraq to the people of Iran who deserve freedom, support for freedom is a task for America and the international community. I said that support for freedom was a centerpiece of the Bush administration's foreign policy, and so it is. But I also believe that support for freedom has been a persistent theme of American foreign policy since America's rise to power at the turn of the 20th century. Support for freedom is not just a tactic or a tool in America's national security strategy. It is the core concept of our national grand strategy, and I believe has been so for over a century. That is one point. My second point this evening is that America cannot advance freedom alone, nor are we alone. Europe and the United States are essentially united in this great task. Together, we are putting the political, economic, and security assets of the transatlantic community to work outside Europe in support of freedom seekers around the world. Now, many of you at this point may be wondering at my assertion of transatlantic comity, especially since so much has been and is being written about the so-called crisis of the transatlantic alliance. But Secretary Rice and our boss, President Bush, believe in that alliance. In a second inaugural address, the President said it very clearly. All the allies of the United States can know that we honor your friendship, we rely on your counsel, and we depend on your help. The concerted effort of free nations to promote democracy is a prelude to our enemy's defeat. Let me repeat that. The concerted efforts of free nations to promote democracy is a prelude to our enemy's defeat. Since the President's second inaugural, which set out the freedom agenda, we've made significant progress in putting this concerted effort of free nations to work on an agenda of worldwide action. Just last week, you saw German Chancellor Merkel at the White House, alongside President Bush, stating her commitment to transatlantic unity in confronting the challenge of Iran and solidarity in advancing freedom throughout the world. The day before Chancellor Merkel arrived in Washington, I was in Austria, meeting with my counterparts from the 25 nations of the European Union, discussing how we could advance freedom in Belarus, consolidate it in Ukraine, and support forces of freedom in other countries. Last November, European foreign ministers met with Secretary Rice and counterparts from the broader Middle East at the Forum for the Future in Bahrain to pledge support for democratic reform and reformers in that region. And in December, NATO foreign ministers met in Brussels to approve the way ahead for NATO's expanding mission to increase security in Afghanistan. That is the reality of transatlantic cooperation today. Chancellor Merkel's language of common purpose is what we hear from European governments so that a strong Europe can act in partnership with the United States. What we no longer hear are the voices calling for a strong Europe as a counterweight to the United States, a check on U.S. economic, political, or military power. Despite the debate in 2003 and 2004 over Iraq, there exists, I contend, a developing transatlantic consensus that our shared interests cannot be separated from our shared values, that democratic governance has a greater legitimacy than other forms of governance, and that this is true everywhere in the world. More, there exists a growing consensus that the purpose of U.S.-European cooperation is not to simply manage problems or serve as a regulator of value-free competition, but to support common action in the pursuit of freedom. Now, I am aware, painfully, of the skepticism with which European publics regard the United States and, frankly, regard this administration. Skeptics, by nature, make news. And the media has long given more than ample attention to the occasional lurid poll results that show divisions, divides, gaps in mutual skepticism between Americans and Europeans. But most have overlooked other, more hopeful signs. According to the German Marshall Fund poll released last September, an enormous majority of European public opinion, 74%, supports joint European-American action to advance democracy in the world. While the same poll reflected a desire for Europe to take on superpower status, the Europeans look for their superpower to join the United States in support of the #1 U.S. foreign policy objective, the advancement of freedom. Now, talk can be cheap and theory can be cheap, and theory is useful to the degree that it produces useful actions. And the time has come to put theory to work in the service of freedom, and that is our objective for 2006. let me report to you the actions the United States and Europe have been taking to advance freedom, and let me outline what we hope to achieve together this year. In the Balkans, rather than wait to be overtaken by the next disaster, the so-called contact group, which brings together the United States, Russia, and key European countries, has launched an effort to resolve the last major open question in that region, which is Kosovo's final status. As part of this effort, we are advancing prospects for a European future for Bosnia, Croatia, Macedonia, Albania, and Serbia and Montenegro as well, if they meet the conditions. Having set the stage over the past few months, in 2006, we, the United States and Europe, will have to show united strength to bring the Balkans from post-war to pre-Europe. In Eastern Europe and Eurasia, the United States and Europe have acted to support and now to consolidate democracy in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan, to help the Belarusian people achieve democracy, and to encourage countries such as Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan to move more decisively and consistently in the direction of democracy. In 2006, we must be prepared to stand by our friends, like President Saakashvili of Georgia and Yushchenko of Ukraine, when they are under pressure, as they sometimes are, and to push our friends to maintain their reforms even in the face of difficulties. Just over the past couple of weeks, we've seen how real these pressures are. On New Year's Day, the Russians turned off the flow of natural gas to Ukraine in what appeared to be political pressure. This raised new questions about Russia's intentions toward its neighbors and Russia's willingness to assume its responsibilities as a major reliable energy supplier. The clear and swift reaction from Europe and the United States alleviated this crisis for the moment and pointed both Russia and Ukraine toward steps each needed to take. But the United States and Europe will have to work together in 2006 and with willing partners in the region, hopefully Russia, and certainly the gas producers of Central Asia, to bring transparency, genuine market principles, and openness to the European and Eurasian energy market. In Eurasia, we will have to demonstrate clarity about our goals, democracy, and through democracy, stability and strengthened sovereignty, while being realistic about what we can achieve in any given year and in any given election. We will have to be prepared in 2006 to stand up for freedom in the face of dictators. In Uzbekistan, the United States faced a choice last summer. We could have kept our military base in Karshi-Khanabad had we turned a blind eye to President Karimov's attempt to grab some 450 refugees who had fled after the crackdown in Andijan. We could have saved an important facility used to support our operations in Afghanistan had we soft-pedaled our reaction to human rights abuses. We could have, but we didn't. We chose to save lives rather than wink at dictatorship. And the pressure on Tashkent came not just from Washington, but also from capitals across Europe. When it came time to get the Uzbek refugees out of harm's way, the government of Romania opened its doors. So Americans and Europeans, again, showed commitment to the same goals. In Belarus, we stand together with the European Union in our call for free and fair elections this March. As the nations along the frontiers of freedom open their societies and reconnect with the world, the Belarusian government knows that it is doomed to isolation if it continues to stifle voices of freedom. There is no space between Europeans and Americans on Belarus. Transatlantic cooperation is also focused on the Middle East. We have advanced Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking further than almost anybody in Europe thought possible. Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza and the opening of the Rafah crossing, with the European Union, by the way, taking on a major security responsibility, has given the Palestinian people a chance to start building their future state in reality, not just in rhetoric. Now we stand ready to help the Palestinians develop effective instruments of governance, as they must if they are to achieve the statehood they seek and deserve. NATO stands at the center of our global democratic security community. And NATO is a place where transatlantic power, and I mean power in the broadest sense, including also political, economic, and moral power, is translated into action. We've outlined a way ahead to strengthen NATO, and give it the tools it needs to secure and advance freedom. NATO continues to change radically from its Cold War identity. As the wall came down, NATO was wonderfully prepared to fight one big war in Europe, but it never fired a shot in anger. There was constant commentary about NATO going out of business. There was vigorous debate about whether NATO should ever act out of area, meaning outside of Europe. Today, NATO is an alliance in action, with operations across the globe, from Afghanistan to Iraq, the Mediterranean, and the Balkans, in support of transatlantic security. The NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, mission in Afghanistan, showcases the capabilities that the alliance is developing, supporting President Karzai's governments in its efforts to build freedom and security for a nation, even as the United States and other coalition partners root out the remnants of the Taliban and their terrorist allies. This November, at NATO summit in Riga, we need to give NATO the tools it needs to do its job. Now let me now turn to 3 additional issues that will occupy much transatlantic attention in the coming year. In Iraq, political debate and jockeying for power is taking place in the aftermath of that country's free December elections. We tend to get stuck looking at the news of the day, but if you take a step back and look at the past year, it's clear that Iraq has undergone a remarkable political transformation. The American debate on Iraq has escalated in a way I see as understandable, and I'm glad I live in a country where issues of war and peace are debated. But the debate often seems disconnected from progress on the ground. In the meantime, however, the European debate has moved forward in an interesting and frankly welcome direction. I'm hearing more and more voices like that of Chancellor Merkel, who reminded Americans and Europeans alike that a democratic Iraq is in everyone's interests. Even French officials, like French Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin, now say that the international community must go forward all together to achieve success. Given the history of the debate between the Americans and the Europeans on Iraq, with the Germans and French sounding like this, clearly, some corner has been turned. Whatever our disagreements with Europe about the decision to remove Saddam Hussein from power, Europeans have come to realize that democracy's failure in Iraq would be a grave blow to our common security and to the prospects for reform and stability throughout the Middle East. In contrast, success in Iraq would set the stage for advancement of the freedom agenda throughout that region. Words are not enough. It is important that Europeans act on that realization. As the new Iraqi government takes shape, it will be the most democratic government in the region, a government elected by the people for the people of that long-suffering nation. The new government deserves our support, and it deserves the support of democratic allies around the world. This gives Europeans the chance to support fully the Iraqi people in their elected government. That support can take many forms: military, capacity building, political support, but it needs to be unstinting. In recent weeks, U.S., European, and indeed international patience with Iran has ended. Over the past year, we worked closely with the EU3, France, Germany, Britain, to curtail Iran's nuclear weapons program and find a way forward. We're on the same page with the Europeans, but the Iranian regime is off in its own world. Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons is alarming, but the problem is broader. Not only is the regime in Tehran determined to develop nuclear weapons, it also supports terrorism. Not only does it support terrorism, but the regime is hostile to democracy in principle. Ahmadinejad's bizarre remarks about destroying Israel remind one of another era. In some ways, this is just another dictatorship desperately trying to legitimize its rule by externalizing an imagined threat. In other ways, this is a dictatorship seeking to misuse Islam, a religion the United States holds in the greatest respect, as an excuse for justifying threats and violence. But in any case, in its current anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying form, this raving is as familiar as it is ugly. This ugliness runs contrary to the honor and respect we have for the Iranian people. As Secretary Rice said last week, This is about the Iranian regime, and it is the Iranian regime that is isolating Iran. As she noted, the Iranian people, frankly, deserve better. We do indeed need to draw a distinction. Have the Iranian people chosen this path of increasing international isolation? Do they support the regime and its hate-filled language? We should not assume so. Iran is home to a great civilization, a people with a glorious past, and one would hope an equally glorious future. To draw a parallel, we did not wage the Cold War against the peoples of captive nations. We knew that the communist regimes and their peoples were distinct. We should not now accept that theocracy and isolation are the fate or desire of the Iranian people. International pressure on the regime will increase in 2006. It should, but the world's democracies should at the same time reach out to the Iranian people. In addition to our efforts to deal with the nuclear challenge, in 2006, the United States and Europe should offer an agenda of hope for Iran. Not so far from Tehran, across the border to the west, Iraq's Shia and other communities are realizing their aspirations through democracy. The changes taking place there, the hope for a brighter tomorrow, are being noted by the Iranian people. This brings me to the third and final major item on the U.S.-European agenda, our combined efforts to advance reform in the broader Middle East. You may recall, I certainly recall, the skepticism and frankly the derision with which this initiative was greeted when the administration launched it 2 years ago. But as with the case of European attitudes toward Iraq, this skepticism has changed. Just before Thanksgiving, I traveled with Secretary Rice to Bahrain for a meeting of senior officials and civil society pioneers from Europe and the region. What I heard from civil society leaders such as Egypt's Saad Ibrahim was remarkable. While many Europeans approach discussion of reform in the broader Middle East cautiously, fearing high expectations for democracy, we heard the boldest words, the most ambitious hopes coming from the people of the region. Now, do the governments of the region embrace these democratic dreams with the same enthusiasm? Perhaps not yet. But reformers are there, in and out of government. And the United States and Europe, the two great centers of democratic legitimacy in the world, are standing with them. And our faith in democracy, our faith in the natural right and longing of every man, woman, and child to be able to guide their future should not be less than those of the reformers in the region. In 2006, let us reach out, assist, and empower reforms and reformers in the broader Middle East. We should work with them, as Secretary Rice has said, to transform volatile status quos that have no future and certainly no purpose. We should not be impatient, but we have started, and we must keep faith with our values and with those in the region who share them. We in government frequently overestimate what can be accomplished in the short run, but we often underestimate what we can accomplish in the long run. Those of us who lived through the dramatic changes that swept across Eastern Europe in a very short period of history know that the status quo does not last forever. In the broader Middle East, too, we have made a start, and we must continue. I'd like to make one final point before hearing from you. Why Europe? What does Europe bring to the table? What can we do with Europe that we can't do alone? Now, let me acknowledge, at the risk of igniting debate from the recent past, that unilateral American action is always an option. But you know, and I know, that it is not the best option. We and our friends and allies throughout the world, starting with Europe, can and must do better. Together, America and Europe constitute a single democratic civilization with common values. Together, America and Europe constitute a quorum of democratic legitimacy. That is not a legal observation so much as a political one, but I believe it to be accurate. When divided, we create a moral fog over events and their significance. When united, we are clear. The enemies of freedom want the United States and Europe to be, the friends of freedom want the United States and Europe to be united. The enemies of freedom would rather we stayed in the fog. Do we differ with Europe on tactics? At times, and they with us. During the Cold War, we differed nearly every day. But our united strategy, rooted in common values, led to victory. And in this present battle for freedom, in the face of this latest iteration of totalitarian ideology, our current strategy, rooted in these values, with America and Europe together, will also result in victory. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Ambassador Fried, we thank you for, and we appreciate you giving us such a comprehensive and clear presentation of American policy. Ambassador Fried will recognize people for questions and repeat the questions, and I told him that you'd probably let him know if he forgot to repeat the question. Please make them as concise as you can.
Would I please define freedom? Freedom, and we could obviously have a very long discussion of this. But I will define freedom for these purposes as rooted in a democratic political system, which in turn is rooted in recognition of inalienable rights of people. Now, there is behind this a large debate as to whether freedom is the exclusive property of European civilizations and the immediate heirs to European civilizations. And it is often said in a rather crude way that democracy is not for Arabs. All right? You haven't said that. I have heard it said, including by some Europeans. A fundamental belief of this administration is that freedom is for everyone. President Bush has said that freedom is not America's gift. It is rooted, as he says, in the Almighty's gift of dignity to every person. It also seems to me, and Secretary Rice says this more eloquently than I'm about to, that democracy and freedom is, in fact, a natural state of affairs, more natural than dictatorship. Dictatorship is, in fact, imposed. And we know this because dictators use secret police, crooked courts. No, we don't. I believe there is a fundamental difference between democracies with their flaws and their imperfections. And I do believe that since human beings are not perfectible, our institutions are also not perfect. And totalitarian countries. I've lived in totalitarian countries, and there is a fundamental difference. There is a difference between a country where the issues of war and peace, the issues of one government's approach to legal issues, to fighting the war on terrorism is debated, and a government where raising those questions gets you fired from your job and thrown into prison. Okay? So I'll take that. I'll take on that battle. Well, please do.
I'm Alla Oliger. I'm with Lockheed Martin. I've been with the United States for 26 years. I was born in Russia, former Soviet Union. I was born, received my education, and I didn't realize what the freedom was until I left Russia and I arrived in the United States. You take freedom for granted. Freedom is everything. You can speak about everything you want. You can do everything you want. And I am so thankful to all your efforts that the United States is doing in Ukraine and Belarus to promote freedom and democracy. Because I want the people that I left behind to have the same freedom that I have here. And I want to tell you that your speech really touched me. And I am just so excited because of all these activities, and I'm hoping all the other people will be just as happy as I am. I've been here for all these years, and I am 100% US citizen, and I would die for this country. And unless you really experienced other boundaries of the freedom, it's very difficult to understand what the freedom is.
I won't try to improve on that. The question was, what is the U.S. government doing to advance freedom in Russia and Saudi Arabia? Two different questions, two different answers. In Russia, we are concerned by what is unquestionably backsliding from the more hopeful period of the mid-90s. The pressure on the free media, government takeover of I believe, all national television networks, pressures on NGOs, the climate of, some have called it a climate of fear, others have called it a climate of repression, others call it managed democracy, is something of consistent concern to us. It is certainly true that our relations with Russia, in the end, are affected by our assessment of where that country is going, whether it is moving in a democratic direction or whether it is moving backwards. And it does affect our relations. It does affect our ability to look at Russia as a partner. We do have a lot of interests with Russia. We have to work with them. We're going to work with them on the Balkans, on Iran, in the Middle East. But our concern about Russia also requires us to reach out to Russian civil society, to express our concerns when we have them, and to support the civil society activists as best we can. Now, in Saudi Arabia, when the administration started talking about freedom in the broader Middle East, the question, the equivalent question to yours that I heard was, it's all very well to say so in Washington. Are you going to say so in Saudi Arabia or Egypt? Are you going to go there? So Rice went to Cairo University and gave a speech on freedom in the broader Middle East. What we have done, what this administration has done, is remove, quite frankly, a red line around the broader Middle East that had existed for decades. A red line that said, well, human rights is very well, but not for this part of the world, okay? Not for this part of the world. President Bush has been accused of a lot of things. One of the things he's been accused of is never admitting any mistake. But when we began to launch this initiative, in his speech, which did so in London in 2003, he got up and said, American administrations were wrong, have been wrong for the past 60 years because we simply tried to buy security by sacrificing freedom, and we got neither. We have succeeded, and the we in this case is not just the Bush administration, because there are a lot of, this is broader. It's Europeans and others who support us. We've managed to change the conversation about freedom in the Middle East. Now, whether it's us or whether we're simply following people in the region that are doing it, I can't say. I suspect it's the latter, but I'm proud to be part of this process. There is a freedom, democracy, reform is now front and center in the region, including in Saudi Arabia. And to make change happen, you first have to change the intellectual climate. You have to have people thinking about it and talking about it. And then you have rulers who will either institute reforms or pretend to. But you have begun in changing things, and that's what we've decided to do, and that's what we are putting our efforts. The question was about theocratic strains in Islam, and can democracy be applied to the Islamic world when there is such a strong tradition of having, of God ruling instead of people ruling? I had this conversation And this is a good question. I had this conversation with a senior Turkish official who who heads the equivalent of the Ministry of Religious Affairs in Turkey. And I put that question to him, and I've not forgotten his response. It was fascinating. He said, in the Ottoman Empire, during the time of the Caliphate, okay, so this is the 19th century, we worked out the concept of the separation of mosque and state. And the concept we worked out is that political sovereignty rests with the people. It is not a challenge to God, it is simply separate from God. Political sovereignty rests with the people. Those were his words. And he said, now remember, it's not just Istanbul where we worked it out, because the Ottoman, if we figured this out in Istanbul, it was also known in Cairo and in Damascus. Don't forget that. He said, don't go on about moderate Islam, because that suggests that Islam itself is not moderate, that you have to modify it. You have to throw an adjective in front of it. Islam, he said, recognizes the separation of mosque and state. It recognizes the principle of democracy. And these people who claim otherwise are not acting in the Islamic tradition. Now look, I'm not an Islamic scholar, but that was very impressive. Look, all religions have dealt with issues of, God's realm, man's realm, where you draw the line. We debate that in this country, obviously, but I can't accept that Islam is such a special world that democracy does not apply. And after all, Turkey is a democracy, and the ruling party there started out as an Islamist party, and now if you ask them what they are, they say, yeah, we're about as Islamic as a Christian Democratic Party in Germany is Christian. That is, from that tradition, we are a modern center-right party. Others would disagree, and they say, strip away the mask, and it's bad. But so far, the Turkish AK Party has been a democratic, responsible party, very popular, and determined to take Turkey into Europe. So that's a good question, and we've thought about it. The question was, if I do you justice, ma'am, why did the administration go into Iraq so heedlessly with such bad results, and could this money and these resources not have been better spent helping other people in the world, if I've got the spirit right? Yes. In the end, this administration will be judged by the outcome in Iraq to a very great degree. And that outcome, in my view, is A, as yet unknown, and B, more likely, in my view, to be successful than I suspect in your view, though I don't want to speak for you. We could spend the rest of the evening debating Iraq pro and con. As the administration saw it, after September 11th, our tolerance for dictators with a history of using weapons of mass destruction, and that there is no debate about Saddam Hussein's history of using chemical weapons, was limited. We regarded it as a strategic problem. There will be books written about what we did right and what we did wrong. However it ends up in Iraq, I suspect everything written in 20 years will show that the result, whatever it is, was inevitable. That is the trouble, whatever it is. The trouble with making judgments now when you're in the middle of a situation like this, of a conflict like this, is that we don't yet know how it will turn out. But I suspect it will turn out better than many believe. At the moment, the challenge we have in Iraq is to support the Iraqi people who have made their choice known by going to the polls repeatedly and in increasing numbers each time to vote for democratic governance. The nature of the enemy we face in Iraq is also pretty clear. These are people who are killing other Iraqi civilians and would kill more if they could. The Iraqi people, in overwhelming numbers, have voted for their own democratic future. The Iraqi people also want to build their institutions so that the coalition forces leave. It's our responsibility at this point, regardless of the debate about the wisdom of the decision in 2003. I think it was the right decision. You and others disagree. Regardless of that decision or the stewardship in Iraq that has been ours, we have a responsibility to make that place as the best possible country we can, working with the Iraqi people. Again, that's all I can say at this point. I appreciate the American debate, and I'm glad we have this kind of a debate. But that's the view I have. The question was, what is the administration's position about Turkey's entry into the European Union? We have always supported it, assuming that Turkey fulfills the criteria. The European Union invited Turkey to come in. Turkey's got to make the grade. If it does, it should be in. I also think it would be a good thing for Europe, a good thing for the Middle East, a good thing for reform generally if Turkey were to succeed in joining the European Union. So it would be, the European Union would not be a Christian club. It would be a club of European countries linked by values and aspirations. So, very clear position. The question was about Azerbaijan. They have oil, they have gas. We are helping train their military, and the questioner said they had an unusual election. My comment is that's a polite way of saying a very flawed election, an imperfect election, which is what I suspect you meant, and what's our policy toward the country. I said earlier that we need to be very clear about what we want, which is democracy, and very realistic about what we can achieve in any country, in any given year, in any given election. Azerbaijan's last parliamentary elections did not meet the standard of free and fair. But they weren't a complete joke either. That is, there was an opposition. The opposition campaigned. When we looked at the election, there were some districts where there was fraud committed and where an honest observer couldn't certify the results in that district as being fair. In other places, the results were pretty straight. You know, the exit polls and the official results matched up pretty well. What's our policy? We want to see Azerbaijan secure, sovereign, prospering, and democratic. All of those things. And we push them on democracy. We also support them in their economic reforms. And we work with them on security issues. They are a little worried about Iran. They're in a rough neighborhood. We also want to see peace in the region. They've been in a dispute with Armenia, which has resulted in war and conflict over the past 15 years or so, and we want to see that end. So Azerbaijan is an example of a country where our rhetoric, our objectives meets hard reality, and you have, in the administration, one has to push as best you can to get the best results you can, clear about your objectives, and move on from there. Now, we deal with countries which are in a kind of halfway stage, not vicious dictatorships, not fully democratic, all the time. And we face these questions every day. I don't know that there's a right answer, but we do the best we can. The question was, President spoke of depending on the Council of Allies, but we went into Iraq without allies, so doesn't that mean we have to listen more and better in the future? Is that about right? Okay. Well, look, in Iraq, Europeans were divided about Iraq. We did not go in alone. The British, the Spanish, the Poles, the Australians, the Portuguese, a lot of others were with us. The French and the Germans were solidly against it. So were the Belgians. So European governments were divided. I mean, that's just a fact. There are now most NATO countries at one time had some forces in Iraq. That's also a fact. But what you're saying is not completely wrong. Obviously, a lot of European publics were pretty much against the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And there was a lot of talk in the first term about coalitions of the willing and unilateralism and a huge debate about this. We want to strengthen the institutions that bring together Europe and the United States. We want to strengthen NATO as an institution. Now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say we want to strengthen NATO so it can support coalitions of the willing. I said we want to strengthen NATO as an institution. We want to work with Europe as such. That means spending a lot of time consulting with Europe, achieving a consensus, listening to Europeans about tactics, and we've been doing a lot of that lately. I'm going to Belarus in 2 weeks, and I'm going with the European Union, joint trip. On Ukraine, when the Russians cut off the gas, the first call I made was to the European Union to coordinate a response on the morning of January 1st. I won't forget it. What you say is essentially correct, that we need to be working with Europe. Europe needs to work with us as well. And we need to spend less time debating the nature of the US-European relationship and more time putting that relationship to work, doing things together that need to be done. And the thrust of the argument in my speech is that we are busy doing that. The question was, what are we going to do about Iran's nuclear weapons program, given that President Ahmadinejad has declared his intention and hope that Israel be wiped off the map? Will we do something ourselves, or will we wait, if I can paraphrase, for the Israelis to do the job as they did in Iraq in 1981? We very, very much hope that a diplomatic solution can be found. That is where our efforts are focused at present, and we're committed to pursuing that course. We believe that the next step is to take Iran to the Security Council. We believe that Iran is in fact susceptible to diplomatic pressure of that sort. The Iranians claim they aren't, and when someone shouts, "I don't care what you say, I don't care what you say," you think maybe they do care what we say. And Iran needs to be faced with a united international, a united diplomatic front. The Iranians say it won't make any difference. We think it will, and we are working very closely with the so-called EU3, Britain, France, Germany, and reaching out to the Russians, hopefully the Chinese, other countries on the UN Security Council, and we want to pressure the Iranians so that they come back to the talks in good faith and negotiate seriously. That's where we are. The question is, what would the Middle East look like if we had responded, I'll put this in sort of State Departmentese, if the administration at the time had responded more robustly, right, to the seizure of the American embassy. I can't do a what if. I can't do counter history. I mean, I have no idea what would have happened had the Carter administration done something different than what it did. Militarily, you know, the one thing the Carter administration tried in early 1980 was a rescue of the hostages, and that was a complete disaster. You know, people were killed, a mess. So I can't answer that, but I can say that we cannot make ourselves secure either by ignoring threats when they gather or by ignoring common values. Neither one is acceptable. This is my language. Nobody else in the administration, thank goodness, talks this way, but I think we looked at the Middle East as a kind of gas station. We wanted the gas, we wanted it cheap, and we didn't care what they did out back, okay? It's hands off, right? Whatever you do in the dark alley isn't, you know, all I want to do is get my tank filled. That did not work out very well. We ignored political pathologies which created a situation in which people from that region flew airplanes into buildings on September 11th. That was before Iraq, before Afghanistan. That was, you know, bin Laden's complaint had to do with the end of the caliphate in 1924. It was not, this is not a political agenda susceptible to negotiations. The answer to this challenge in the end is political, and it is through reform and support of democracy rather than purely military answers, though they have their place. That, in turn, suggests that this challenge is generational, and it is a challenge no less important and no less demanding than that of the Cold War. I mean, think of American policy toward Europe in 1945. We had fought 2 world wars. Europe was in ruins. Eastern Europe was occupied by Stalin, who wasn't much better than Hitler. And American grand strategy was breathtakingly bold and naive at the same time. We'll just fix Europe, make it a prosperous democracy, and then we'll contain the Soviet Union till it collapses, and then they'll be democratic. You know, ha, ha, ha. But 45 years later, that's exactly what happened. Now, that is a successful grand strategy. But at the time, no one at the time said, these administration figures who have put the strategy together are giants, they're geniuses. No, the newspapers at the time said, they're fools, this is a disaster. After the 5 years after the end of World War II, look what happened. Eastern Europe becomes dominated by the communists. Mao triumphs in China. Stalin gets a nuclear bomb 5 years ahead of schedule. The Korean War. 5 years after VJ Day, it looks like we failed completely, which is why it's hard to make a judgment until you know the way things are going to come out. All right, not quite what you asked, but I thought I'd take the opportunity. Yes, sir. The question was, suppose the United States and the civilized world is playing by one set of rules of democracy and prosperity and respect for the individual, and the Iranians just want to kill, die, and go to heaven. It's about the question. I don't accept the premise of the question. I don't believe that fanaticism is a natural condition of human beings. I don't think in a democracy a winning political slogan in the long run will be vote for me and I'll make your children suicide bombers. Okay, that's not a sound electoral strategy in the long run. But more, I mean, seriously, no, I don't think people are alike in the sense that democracy will look the same in Iran as it does in the United States. It doesn't look the same in Japan as it does in the United States. Democratic systems will be different, but I don't believe in the clash of civilizations, okay? I just don't. I don't believe that whole peoples are destined for an inferior future or are unworthy of democracy. The theory of a clash of civilizations has, frankly, a very ignoble history. It started in its version in the 1920s. It was an argument that modern civilization democracy was for Northwestern Europeans, Anglo-Saxon and Germanic stock, and everybody else was more or less unready for it. Okay, that's a pretty discredited theory, if not to say a disgusting one. Clash of civilizations presumes that civilization is for certain kinds of people. I don't believe that. I think the history of the United States demonstrates that that is false. Human beings have a natural inclination to be treated with dignity. It is not it is not the intrinsic nature of people in any civilization to want to be dragged away at midnight by the secret police, to want to live in dysfunctional dictatorships, to live in an Orwellian society. I don't think that comes naturally to people. I do share the American kind of naive optimism about human possibilities. History argues another way. Our country argues that things are possible. And in any event, I think the history of the last 25 years shows us both the dangers of expecting too much too soon, but also the greater danger of not expecting anything at all. Thank you.
We certainly thank you for what has been a masterful presentation. If you weren't so cogent and forthright, we couldn't have covered as much ground as we did. I think it's been a perfectly marvelous evening. We're very much in your debt. Thanks so much.
Thank you.